As I've made my slow and winding way through the Castlevania series, one thing I've found that I've had to do is make some fairly judicious choices in terms of what versions of a given game to play. Actually, this is a wider concern I've had with the blog, as I occasionally make the call to play a newer port or even the odd remake here and there as a way of pulling together my thoughts on a game while also not trying to source what are sometimes quite niche and obscure versions of a game's release. Take today's subject, Castlevania Rondo of Blood, for example. It released originally on the PC Engine Super CD-ROM 2, and have you played that? I sure haven't. In fact, I thought I'd never heard of it until I looked it up and realised it's what's known in America and more widely on the internet as the TurboGrafx 16, a relatively short-lived competitor to the NES that failed to release on time and was stuck competing with the more powerful Super Nintendo and Mega Drive/Genesis. I'm sure I could have sourced that, but good grief, that felt like a faff, especially as the original release of Rondo of Blood was Japanese only. There was a Super Nintendo release in English which I considered for review, but that one, known simply as Dracula X, is actually supposedly a bit different from the original, featuring unique levels. In the end, I plumped for the PSP remake Dracula X Chronicles, which, as far as I can tell, might share the name with the SNES Castlevania, but is actually a more faithful remake of Rondo of Blood, at least enough to give an accurate idea of how that game works. You're listening to the almighty Backlog. I'm Ellie, and today's review is on Castlevania Rondo of Blood. Available at time of recording for new 3DS, PC, PlayStation Portable, PS4, the Super Nintendo, Switch, TurboGrafx 16, the Wii U and the Xbox One. This review is based on the PSP version. Originally released in October of 1993, developed and published by Konami, it's an action game and How Long to Beat has an average playtime of about 5 hours. Despite initially releasing only in Japan, Rondo of Blood is probably still one of the more famous entries in the franchise. This is probably partly because the game's protagonist, Richter Belmont, is a recurring character in the series, notably appearing in Symphony of the Night. If you've been following along with the Netflix Castlevania animated series, you'll have seen him as well, given he's the protagonist of Nocturne, the second show under that banner. He's liked enough to even have shown up in games like Smash Bros. And Dead Cells. I imagine his popularity stems at least in part from the fact that he's the first Castlevania hero to have proper dialogue, bandying words with villains including the evil priest Shaft and of course Dracula himself, though of course his best and namiest lines come in Symphony of the Night rather than here. You're not traipsing through the haunted halls of Dracula's castle for the scintillating dialogue though. You're here to beat undead hordes up with a magic whip. That's precisely how Rondo of Blood works, in true Classicvania fashion. Like its forebears, it's a solid, often difficult side-scroller in which you, your whip, and a veritable arsenal of magic items are let loose on the minions of Dracula. The formula is practically rote by this point. If you've played any of the previous games, then you know precisely how this works. The only question that really hangs over the game, as it does with basically every one of them in my opinion, is which of the NES trio does it most owe its lineage to, and how does it stand against its contemporaries? To me, the most obvious link is to Castlevania 3. Like that game, Rondo of Blood embraces the idea of limited non-linearity, allowing players to explore multiple paths through its levels to find new alternate stages, each one with special secrets to find. Chief among these are people Richter can attempt to rescue, which in turn contribute towards achieving the game's alternate ending. The pathways one can take aren't always entirely obvious, so finding them and then in turn finding the ways in those stages to rescue the missing people can be a tough job, especially given the series' typical difficulty. Regardless of whether you do or don't take on the challenge of reaching the game's best ending, Rondo of Blood still has some quite creative levels, enemies and of course boss fights. In any Castlevania of this era, there's always that question of what is it adding to the franchise in a mechanical sense, and in Rondo of Blood's case that comes down to Richter's moveset and the new ability, Item Crash. It's a real shame to see that the advances made in Super Castlevania 4 continue to be eschewed, with little in the way of that game's dynamic stage design or full 8-way whip control, but Richter does at least have a few tricks to play with. There's a nifty little backflip our hero can pull off, which gives us a tricksy dodge option if you can time it right, and chances are most times you won't, but it's still a little disappointing to see us reduced to a simpler, more basic moveset than a game that came out 2 years prior. The Item Crash ability is the really notable addition for Rondo of Blood. This is a kind of special move available to Richter that allows the player to expend extra hearts, the series' trademark ammunition, to unleash a more powerful alternate attack using whatever item you have equipped. As is ever the case with Castlevania, understanding how your sub-weapons function and now how their respective item crashes work as well remains one of the key measures of one's mastery over the game. Some of these special attacks have gone on to become iconic in the wider scope of the series, in particular those associated with the Cross and Holy Water weapons, which both feature massive screen-clearing attacks. I confess I find myself conflicted with Rondo of Blood. The funny thing about it is that it enjoys such effusive praise, but I came out of it, if anything, a little underwhelmed. I don't think it's a bad game at all, far from it in fact. To reduce Rondo of Blood to the level of a poor game would be, I think, doing it a distinct disservice. And yet, I still can't say that I loved it all that much either. Part of the reason this review was a little delayed in going up, well, other than that my laptop found itself smashed to bits when my daughter, with all the boisterous abandon of a 3-year-old, pushed it off a table to make space for a wooden stable, is that I found myself struggling to articulate what about this game left it feeling so plain, I suppose. The thing is, for me, the classic Vania style of games feel like it thus far peaked with Super Castlevania 4. This again comes back to that notion of which Castlevania does a game draw most of its inspiration from. Prior to 4, my favourite game in the franchise had easily been the first. 4 then feels like the most complete and clear upgrade that stems directly from it. However, for lots of people, 3 is the peak of the series, a reasonable and worthy opinion. I think Rondo of Blood owes more to that game than the first. It keeps a more simplistic style of combat rather than the extravagant approach of 4, and builds its threats around it. Much like in 3, the excitement in Rondo comes from replaying it, from mastering its myriad difficult challenges, and from travelling along the different pathways through the levels in order to find the secrets. If that doesn't hold as much appeal for you, then Rondo itself winds up feeling a little pulled back in terms of development. I made a point at the top of this review of talking about which version I played, and I do wonder if that also had a part in my opinion. There's something beautiful and timeless about sprite work. In fact, I'd gone so far to say that Castlevania is one of the most consistently stunning sprite-based game franchises. But the PSP remake of Rondo obviously doesn't use them, opting instead for a more contemporary style using 3D models. Perhaps that also pokes away at the mystique and vibes of Rondo, and left it looking less than it should have for me. Without sourcing the original, that's hard to know for sure. Regardless, it feels a little frustrating to think that perhaps my time with Rondo was stymied a bit by the version. Even so, I can only play the game in front of me, and I can only take away from it what I felt. Make no mistake, Rondo is still a strong game, and while the preference of many is for its illustrious Metroidvania sequel, I can appreciate that there is still an audience out there that is wistful for classic Vania games. That this is, I think, the first time a Castlevania had voice acting, and therefore a clearly defined personality for its primary characters, is both marvellous and no doubt a reason why it was so warmly received in its day. But there's no escaping the fact that for me, Rondo of Blood felt a bit narrow. Not bad at all, but not quite aspiring to reach the same heights as some of its predecessors. The final score is 4 out of 7. Good. Sure, maybe something doesn't quite work, but at least it has heart, or a spark of excitement that makes it worthwhile despite the faults. Worth a go if you can find it on sale. This has been Ellie on the Almighty Backlog. You can support this project by reading the review over on thealmightybacklog.wordpress.com or by listening to the pod review hosted on RSS and YouTube. Please feel free to follow me over on Mastodon, Blue Sky and or Backlogged by following the links on the website. If you'd like to support the show financially, you can do so by donating via PayPal to thealmightybacklog@gmail.com or by hitting the donate button on the blog. Thank you for listening and have a lovely day.